Hi, I'm Cheri Carlson from Artbeads.com, and today I'm going to show you several different types of closures for finishing off loomed bracelets. So we have several different types of clasps laid out here for you to see. We have button and loop closures, and we have toggles and magnetic clasps, slide-on clasps, fold-over clasps, crimp type bar clasps, and we're going to show you a little bit about each of these and how to go about assembling them. I'm going to start first with the button and loop closure. This one has a button sewn onto one end, and then we've made a seed beaded loop for its closure, and you can see how to do this bracelet in a video tutorial. We show you how to warp the loom and stitch the bracelet and finish the clasp all in one. So you can go there to find that information. The next one is another style of button and loop. We've sewn the button onto the edge of the bracelet and then trimmed the bracelet with leather and then tied the leather in a knot to form the loop for the closure. And then this piece, we made a button out of seed beads and then formed a seed beaded loop to go around that. And all three of these are tutorials in our Learning Center, so you can find out just how we went about making those. Another way of adding a button is to stitch the button onto the top of the beadwork rather than at the end. And so I'm going to show you how to go about setting that up and positioning the button so that it sits nicely. If you hold the button over your beadwork, you can see that I have roughly one row of beads showing on each side, and I think for balance I'd like to see maybe just one row of beads on the end as well. And so I just kind of position the button on top of the beads and eyeball it that way, and then look between the button and the body of work and see where the shank of the button is bumping into the beads. So the shank on my button is kind of a narrow wire, and I can either run the shank so that it's running between the beads this way or across the beads. And part of what is going to determine that is the pattern on the front of the button and which way I want that pattern facing. I'm going to go with the shank of my button running this way. I happen to have an even number of beads in this particular piece, so I want that shank between the halfway point. And so I've moved my thread so that it's coming out. I'm gonna work with these two beads here, and so I've moved my thread so that it's coming to the outside of one of those. And then I'm going to thread my needle through the shank of the button. And I'm going to go over to the other bead. Oops. You can see that. And I'm going to pick up both of those beads and then bring my shank into place. So if you can see between there, the thread is running between two beads and the shank is in the middle. And then I'm going to stitch through that shank again with the needle and through those two beads again. And then I'm going to look at that and decide, how am I going to keep that button nice and secure? And it may mean that I go through both beads, or maybe I go through one bead and out the other side and then back through that shank again. Basically, you want the thread going around the shank of your button several times to keep it nice and secure, and you want the shank of the button sitting up on top of the beads. You don't want it to nest down between the beads, because you want this gap between the back of the button and your beadwork for your loop closure. And so It depends on the size of the beads you have, the number of rows you have, and how thick the shank on the button is can determine just how you get that stitched on. But that's kind of a general way to go about getting that stitched on. And then you'll bring your other end over and make your loop closure coming off of the end of the piece, like we've shown in the other video on how to make a loop closure. So that's a real easy way to stitch a button on, and it also can bring the two ends of the bracelet together nice and close so that you don't have a big gap in between. Then we have toggle clasps, and toggle clasps work great on these types of bracelets. In this case, I maneuvered the thread to near the center but not quite, and added a bead, a jump ring, and a bead, and then stitched back through that end row of beads, and then repeated that several times so that that little jump ring was nice and secure, and then just opened the jump ring and connected it to the loop of the toggle clasp, and then repeated the same on the other end. Usually with the bar end of the clasp, you need to add an extra link or two because that end needs to fold in order to go through that loop. And if it's sitting up too close to the edge of your bracelet, you're not going to be able to get that bar end through the loop. So you want to make sure you give yourself a little working room there. So this is another example done the same way with the little jump ring. You could decide not to do the jump ring and just do beads and stitch the beads directly to the loop that's on the toggle clasp as well. Then we have this magnetic style of bar clasp, and I love this style. It gives such a nice flush closure. It brings the two ends of the bracelet nice and close, and these have loops on the outside that you stitch down to your ends of your work. One of the things that you want to keep in mind, and I'll demonstrate on this piece, is if you just simply hold one end of the clasp up to your work, what you want to be looking at are the loops that are on that clasp, and are they centered? But because this is a little uneven, it can fool you a little bit, and you may not get that clasp centered nicely. So I like to put the clasp together when I'm doing that very first end of the bracelet and stitch it on so that I can see that my clasp is centered nicely on the bracelet. And then you just stitch each loop, working your thread through the beads and getting each loop secure. This is another one, just a longer style of the same type of clasp, and again, just works great for especially these wider pieces. This piece has a slide-on tube. It comes like this, and there's a opening across the back, and I'll demonstrate on this piece. This just slides right over that last row of beads. This particular size happens to fit the 8/0 beads just perfectly. And then one end is closed already, although you can see this one's not quite, so you need to push that over a little bit more. And then you just fold this one over. You can almost push it with your thumb, but you can use a pair of pliers, or you can set it down on your workspace, like, I don't know if you can see, like this, and then just kind of roll it over and push it closed. But super simple way of finishing off a loomed bracelet. And then this is another one that has such a nice finish. This is a fold over clasp, and you can see that there's an opening in the end of the clasp here, and we've threaded the finished strip of beadwork through that opening and then folded it over and stitched it closed. And so I'm going to demonstrate what that looks like. But before I do, I want to show you, this is another style where you would do the same thing. You'd fold this over and stitch that closed, but then on the other end, you'd make a fold over loop so that this hook just hooks right through and acts as your closure. In this case, I'm going to do the same type of end, and then this comes with a little toggle bar, and then just using jump rings to connect your little bar to the loop ends is all you need to finish that one over. I've worked some pink thread into this so that you can see it better. And let me move these things out of the way. Yeah, hopefully you can see this. Okay, so you want to fold the clasp so that you have, you know, so that the clasp moves around in there. You don't want it so tight that it doesn't move, but you don't want a big loop either. You want just kind of a nice medium. My tail's kind of in the way here. And then I'm going to line up. This bead is where my thread is coming from, and I want to match it up to a bead, end bead on the back side, and then bring my thread through. And I'm going to pull that tight, and then I'm going to go back through that end bead where I started from. And because this is pink, it's showing up, but if this were a nice dark thread, you wouldn't see this so much. So now I'm coming out of that starting bead again, and I'm going to go back down the back side, but this time I'm going to go down 2 beads. If you can see, my needle is coming out that second bead over, and then I'm going to run that needle through the second bead that lines up with that on the end of the piece and back, and pull that tight. Then I'm going to go back through the lower bead and then over to the next one and pull that. My little tail is causing me grief there. There we go. And then you can see, if you pull it tight, you can see where it needs to go next, and that's this matching bead. We're just going to go the 1. And then back through that same bead. And over 2. And then you just continue that down to the other end, and then you want to go through that the last 2 beads that match up twice, so it's nice and secure, and then weave your needle in and out of your work to tie off your thread. And then you're going to do that to both ends so that you end up with this nice fold over clasp, and then use jump rings to attach your bar end to one end of your bracelet. So that's super easy, and it has such a nice finished look. When it's all done, you almost don't even see where the fold over finishes. Then I have one more type that I want to show you, and this is a folding crimp type end piece. You just pinch this closed around the thread on the end of a bracelet, not the beads, because you'll risk cracking the beads, but you need threads to be able to crimp that onto. And so what I have here is a loomed piece. I've done this on the Rix loom, but I'm going to cut these threads off as if I had done this on a standard loom, not a continuous wrap. And then we're going to weave a selvage. So I'm going to show you how to do that. In this case, I have the threads, I have enough thread on each end of the bracelet so that I have some working room. And I finished adding all my beads to the piece. And now what I need to do is create this little ribbon of thread so that I have something for that crimp clasp to crimp onto. So I'm going to take my end thread, and you can, before you start the selvage, you may want to tie off this thread so that you know your beads are nice and secure. But then you're just going to weave this needle in and out, or over and under, oops, across the width of the bracelet, and then pull that down so it's up against the beads. And then because I'm over on this last thread, I'm going to start under, and then I'm going to go over, under, over, under, over, under, and over, and then work that thread down so it's up against the other thread. And then we're going to continue that process. I've got some finished on this other end so that you can see that. So on this one, I've worked over and under for about 1/4 of an inch. It took a lot of thread. I'm going to say somewhere between 2 and 3 yards. So you are probably going to have to add thread before you start this process to make sure you have enough to get that nice 1/4 inch worth of selvage. And I also inserted the warp card. You could use, you know, just another piece of cardstock or something. And I've used that to push on the threads to get them nice and snug to each other. One thing that you want to be careful of is when you're working back and forth, you don't want to pull these so tight that the sides start going in too far. You can see they go in a little, and that's fine, but you don't want to pull them so tight that you're cinching those pieces into each other. You want this selvage to pretty much be the width of your finished piece. And then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to cut this off of your loom. Let's assume that we've worked our selvage on both sides. And then we're going to glue this selvage so it's nice and sturdy and secure. You can secure each of these threads by tying them together to each other in groups of 2s, so knot them each off, and you can, if you've got a spare thread, an uneven number, then you can tie your weft thread to it. If you don't have a spare thread, then you can weave your needle in through this selvage a little bit and tie it off so that it's secure. I'm going to, then I'm not going to show you the glue literally, but you're going to just spread this glue onto your selvage, and then you're going to flip it over and spread it on the other side. You could use a toothpick if you're more comfortable with that, and you're going to let that dry. When it's dry, then you're going to trim up all these ends, and I'm just going to go ahead and show you what that looks like. I won't trim completely since I haven't tied my knots, but let's say we're finished and we've tied that all up and it's all nice and dry. Then you're going to bring your little pinch clasp in and position it over your selvage, and then pinch that closed over so that the little teeth of that bar are up near your beads. And you can use a pair of nylon jaw pliers to get that up, oops, tight, if that helps, even just to get it started. And sometimes working at one end and we don't want to break our beads. And you're going to have glue on yours, which will help. The little teeth will start biting into that surface. Mine's a little slippery. So you're going to want to pinch that clasp nice and tight so it's secure. The teeth should bite into your selvage. You can even add another little bit of glue for security, and then bring in your jump rings and your clasp of choice, and then do the same thing on the other end of the bracelet. So as you can see, there are a lot of different options for closures for loomed pieces and other beadwork type pieces. I hope this was helpful. Have fun.